Welcome, everyone, to our third workshop session this afternoon, Discernment and the Will of God. I'm going to introduce our two leaders just briefly. Dr. Carrie Myers is the co-founder of the Stillness Collective, an organization whose mission is to help busy, burdened people find rest, restoration, and stillness through guided Christian meditations, spiritual direction, and retreats. And Sharon Wada, she comes to us from California and currently serves as the co-director of the nonprofit Sustainable Faith. It is a collective of spiritual directors and pastors working to create a spiritually healthy culture among leaders and their communities. So let's welcome both of them today for our third workshop, Discernment and the Will of God.
So we're talking today about, specifically in this conversation, we are talking about, let's see if I can click the slide, about discernment and the will of God. And specifically, we're exploring what does it mean to be a discerning person. And I'm going to hazard a guess that all of us at some points in our lives have had to make decisions of significance. And we found that it may not be easy, that we question, how is it that we can really know the will of God for our lives at key points in our lives? And so in this workshop, we're going to explore a very practical path to discernment and decision-making for those of us who pursue Christian spirituality and who hold Asian American cultural values. And we're also going to explore how those of us who are soul care providers can support those that we care for who are in need of discernment. So here is our agenda roughly. We're going to start with contemplative exercise, excavating a past decision. We're going to look at discernment and decision-making. We're going to look at what it takes to become a discerning person, or rather what a description of that looks like. We're going to look at 3 ways of coming to a decision, or 3 ways of discerning. And we will also look at confirming a decision before we move to Q&A. So we're going to start with this question. And I'm actually going to ask you to, before you read what's on the screen, in fact, let me click away from it. Just going to ask you to take a moment to transition, as we've done at the beginning of our other conversations. So go ahead and just breathe a little bit, settle into your chair, perhaps close your eyes, and just ground yourself in your body and in this space. I want you to notice your breathing. I want you to notice your breath moving in and out of your body. How that breath makes you feel. It's in your body that feels tight or tense. Maybe breathe a little deeper, that tension. If you need to move around a little bit, roll your shoulders or your neck. Feel free to do that. Take a moment to just notice the presence of God in this room, and within yourself. Ask God to be present with us during this learning time. As we make space for discernment, to listen to his voice. God be with us. And go ahead and continue to keep your eyes closed. And I want to invite you to bring to mind a time in your life where you undertook a discernment. Maybe let God wind back the film of your life to a few years, perhaps only a few months, and show you a decision of significance that you have made in the past. What was that question that you were weighing? Remember, if you can, what was your process of discernment like? What did you rely on to make your decision? Was it your instinct? Was it an emotion? Was it your body? Was it advice or a scripture, a prayer or a dream, a memory or logic, or something else? I'm going to give you a chance to share here in person or in the chat. What was the decision you reflected on? And what were one or two factors you considered in your decision-making process? And so that question is up on the screen now if you feel like taking a look. I'll give you a moment to process. And then when you're ready, feel free to speak or to type. It's your decision. And what were one or two ways that you made that decision? What information did you take in or consider?
And I recognize one of the key things was part of the conversation I had with God was I felt so much hunger and desire and joy the more I thought about what it can entail. So I think that was a really key factor of like, is this for me or is this for something more? And that was what I had to sit with for a while. And of course, there's conversations with other people, my spouse, and cost, all the other practical things. And then just kind of waiting on. And a key thing I always notice in my pattern of life is what doors really open.
Okay.
And then when I look at that door, is that a door that I have to walk through just because it's open? Or can I see and wait? So I think there's several questioning in the process and finding key people who can actually want to listen and process. So yeah.
Thanks, Manny. That was a very nuanced and multifaceted answer. And that encompassed where you felt drawn, where you felt joy as you considered becoming a spiritual director, conversations you had with people in your circle that you trusted, and then did God open that door? Thanks.
Sarama from online mentioned that it was past experience and just wisdom from past experience that informed decision making.
Yeah, that's a great point, that often our decisions in the past inform how we make decisions in the present and the future. Thank you.
And then Grace says, a big factor I've always had is being honest with my true motive for why I'm making a decision. And does that draw me closer to God or more into self-sufficiency?
Okay, so more of that self-awareness piece. What are my motives? What are my impulses for making the decision? Does it lead me closer to God or away from God? Those are all really great, very nuanced ways to make decisions. I should have expected that from a room full of soul care providers. So thank you for sharing your wisdom. So for some of you, actually, what I have to say may be a review. What may be new is the Asian American context. And for others of you, this may be new information. So wherever you are, I hope that it meets some of your questions and some of your wonderings. And I'm going to go to the next slide and say one of the things that we wanted to highlight in this exercise was how do we already make decisions? What are our defaults? What are our experiences? And are there ways that we can broaden our understanding, our experience of how we make decisions? And so what is discernment? How does it differ from simply making a decision? And so this quote says, discernment is an ancient Christian spiritual practice that begins with prayer. And I want to highlight both of those things, that if you are in a discernment, you are in a long Christian tradition. And that discernment begins with prayer. It is a prayerful process that we bring God into. Henry Nouwen says, discernment is a spiritual understanding and an experiential knowledge of how God is active in daily life that is acquired through disciplined spiritual practice. Discernment is faithful living and listening to God's love and direction so that we can fulfill our individual calling and shared mission. And so what I want to emphasize in that quote is that discernment is not simply a discrete action where we make a choice to do or to not do something. It is also a way of living that cultivates a daily awareness of God and his desires for us as individuals in the context of God's dreams for the world. One of our insights from spiritual direction is that our deepest, truer desires are often also God's desires. And so as we cultivate self-awareness, we're also cultivating awareness of God. For this reason, discernment takes time. It is not something that we rush, unless of course we have to. If your landlord is saying you have to leave, you may have a decision in front of you that does not take as much time as you would like. If you are having a baby in the next 5 minutes, you may have to make decisions on the fly. Things are contextual, as we have said many times. So when is a decision actually also a discernment? And there's a short list of things that we look for. One is that it's a choice between two good and right things. So if you know something is clearly sinful and wrong, that is not a genuine discernment. So a genuine discernment might be, should I use my time by volunteering for an aid agency? Or is God wanting me to spend more time in prayer? An example of not a discernment would it be better to cheat on my spouse with a person in my office or with a complete stranger? I think you can see the difference between those options, right? Okay. Another criteria in a discernment is a person is free to choose either option. And that means look at your responsibilities, look at the things in your life, and see where you actually have the openings to move. For example, if a person has taken vows of priesthood, they are not necessarily free in that moment to renounce celibacy. A parent with young children is not necessarily free to go leave and become a missionary in another country. And there's also questions of capacity. I am not free to choose to be a nuclear physicist because I'm not good at math. I'm not good at physics. I may want to be a nuclear physicist, but that is actually not a valid option for me. I am not free to choose that option. Okay. A decision as a discernment when it is of significance. For example, career, family, vocation, education, the sort of big questions in life. Perhaps a decision regarding how to care for an aging parent. Should I choose to marry this person? Should I choose to adopt this child? Should I follow this career path or another? And a person must also be psychologically and spiritually mature enough to enter into the process. We don't expect a toddler to enter into discernment. We don't necessarily expect someone who is not quite spiritually formed to be able to enter into a nuanced discernment either. So I'm going to talk about 3 factors in becoming a discerning person. One of them is understanding your life as the locus of God's action. And this phrase, the locus of God's action, is from Elizabeth Liebert and Anne-Marie Pauline Campbell. And they specifically talk about spiritual direction and spiritual practices for women. And their point is that if you're a marginalized person or someone of a marginalized gender, you may often feel that your spiritual experience, that your life experience is somehow not valid compared to a normative white experience. And it is even possible to feel that in an Asian American church if the normative spiritual experience that is held up is that of a white evangelical man, right? And so to see your life as a locus of God's action means that God is active and loving in all of you and in all your parts. So for an Asian American, this means God's action includes those parts of ourselves and our experience that are affected by external and internalized racism, by intergenerational trauma and migration loss, by all kinds of wounding and self-critique. God loves us, every part of us. Seeing ourselves as the locus of God's action also includes an awareness of God's presence in the spheres of our life that may not be valued or taken into consideration by a white North American cultural viewpoint. For example, the importance of family, a collective versus fully individualized orientation. For some Asian Americans, it may be placing a higher value on the supernatural, as well as the material and intellectual. Other factors might be an honor-shame culture, the importance of education, honoring our parents. We also look at noticing God's presence in spheres that may not be valued in our families and our ethnic communities. For example, and I've heard some of this throughout the day, a desire to rest rather than pursue success and achievement unrelentingly, or valuing dreams and desires and hopes and joys rather than only logic or facts or duty or work. All these things play into our lives as the locus of God's action. We also want to hold an awareness of the pressure points for us as Asian Americans. Those have also come up several times this conference. What are the family expectations of marriage and career? Are there mismatches between the communication style of our generation and the older or the younger generation? Are there value mismatches that create friction between our parents and our children and ourselves? These are all factors that we consider individually. And I want to say, if you are a soul care provider, these are also things you can consider with the people that you are accompanying. You can be aware of the Asian American context, how it may impact how a person sees themselves or does not see themselves fully as the locus of God's action, and the pressure points that we feel that may complicate decision making. And so there's an encouragement to provide reminders and affirmations to each other that all of us belongs to God, that God is active in every part of our life. And that's the reason that we return to these 3 circles, right? To show that it is all God's domain. God's fingerprints are everywhere in those 3 circles. Factors I want to consider in becoming a discerning person. The first is to seek inner freedom before you undertake a discernment. And what does that mean, to seek inner freedom? It means that you are in a state of emotional and spiritual equilibrium, that you are able to hold 2 options in your hand and say, if either option is God's will, then I'm okay with it. I am able to freely choose either option if God reveals that to me as his will. Ignatius says inner freedom means that we want and choose only what leads to God's deepening life in me. And so what will lead us best to love, serve, and honor God? That is the thing that we seek when we cultivate inner freedom. The second thing, or actually the third thing that we want to pay attention to, is what is the temperature of your soul? And by that, I'm referring to something that Manny was referring to earlier when she talked about our inner movements. What is the affective state of your soul? And this includes your emotions, your body responses, your intuitions. So when I consider option A or option B, what do I feel? Do I feel encouraged or discouraged? Do I feel life? Do I find dryness? And then once we take our soul's temperature, we consider, all right, where do these feelings come from? Do they come from God or do they come from not God? Perhaps do they come from my selfishness? That was one of the feedback, the responses we got from our audience online. And then if I follow these emotions, these bodily responses, intuitions, what do they lead me towards? Do they lead me towards God or farther from God? Do they lead me towards more faith, joy, and peace? Or do they lead me towards less faith and hope and joy and peace? Okay, so these are things we want to be aware of when we take our soul's temperature. How do we feel? Where are those feelings coming from? Where do they lead us toward? As a soul care provider, I also want to say, let me just click back for a second. As a soul care provider, how can we help the people that we are sitting with? 1, we can ask them these questions. To what degree are you feeling inner freedom? What's your soul's temperature? What are you feeling? Where are those feelings from? Where are they leading you to? And then again, how are you experiencing your life as the locus of God's action? And once you've helped your person discern or discover that they are in a position to begin discerning this question, to begin balancing these 2 options, these are 3 ways or modes of discerning. And basically, these are just sort of 3 different ways to hold these questions. 1 is deep knowing, 1 is tracking your soul's temperature over time, and 1 is reason and imagination. They are not exclusive of each other. They are just slightly different modes, and I will go through what they are. So the first mode or way of discerning is called deep knowing. And this is another way of saying that you know that you know that you know. It's almost as if God came down and told you, and you just know in your innermost being that this is the way you should go. You feel drawn to it. You have no doubt that this action represents God's activity and invitation. And it may develop over time as a slow and steady sense of peace and certainty, or it may come quickly, but either way, your conviction is rock solid. And when you talk about it to people, they're able to sense that rock solidness, okay? And so an example of this, I'm gonna talk throughout these 3 examples of different moves that my husband and I have made with our kids, because we've moved a lot. And so one of our moves actually came out of this experience of deep knowing. We were living in Queens during the pandemic. We had a sense eventually that God was going to invite us to move to Staten Island, us and our church ministry, that we were going to pack up and move to Staten Island. We didn't know when it was going to happen, but we just kind of had a feeling it was coming. And then in the summer 2 years ago, our landlord said, guess what? I'm selling your house that you have lived in for over 10 years at ridiculously below market value. And we said, that's it. We're going to Staten Island. And we just knew that we knew that we knew. We did not have to undertake a long process of vetting or discernment or questioning. We just had a sense that it was coming, and when we knew it was time because of external circumstances, we felt that inner certainty. And we also had confirmation from people around us. A mentor called and said, I think you guys should really move to Staten Island, things like that. And so there was this confluence of events as well as our own feelings, and then external events in God's leading that said, pack your bags. Get ready to live in the forgotten borough of New York City. And we did. This may be not the most frequent way that God speaks to us, but when it happens, it's very recognizable. And it's very joyful because there's a simplicity about it. The next way is tracking your temperature over time. And again, this is kind of what Manny was referring to. It's noticing your effective responses and tracking them over time. And I want to say it's almost like, if you are trying to conceive and you have an ovulation thermometer, right? You track your temperature every day. And as you track it every day, then you can notice fluctuations that say, oh, now's a good time to have a baby, right? And it's a little bit like that. You cultivate a habit of noticing over time, what is my soul's temperature today? And how do my responses move over time as I think about this decision in front of me? And you may ponder these 2 alternatives against each other. I can take job A, or I can move my job, or I can stay at the position where I'm at. When I think about staying, what do I feel? Do I feel energized? Do I feel inspired? Do I feel hope? When I think about staying, what do I feel? Perhaps I feel boredom. Perhaps I feel sadness. And perhaps as I'm discerning my emotions and I think about how God is speaking to me with these emotions, I feel drawn to one direction or the other. And so for this example, I'm going to talk about another move that my husband and I and my family undertook. And this is back many years ago, probably 15 years ago, when we were living in Jacksonville, Florida. We had crash landed there after a huge ministry failure. We were jobless. We didn't know what to do with our future. We were living in Florida because it was cheap and because we had family there that would help us. And the whole time we were discerning, what is next? What is God inviting us to as our next stage of life after we recover, after we kind of get back on our feet after this ministry failure? And this was really more my husband's discernment than mine, because he really wanted to be a pastor. And he was not sure quite how to make it happen. And so over, I would say, a period of 3 or 4 years, he had repeated conversations with God. How am I, what are my emotions toward pastoring? Who do I want to pastor? Who are my people that you're giving me to shepherd? And he would notice just God's responses and his responses over time. And finally, he was able to confirm in himself that his deep desire and longings led him back to New York City to be a pastor in a church for immigrants and internationals. And so was this decision dropped from the sky all at once? No, this was a decision that evolved steadily over time. And he knew the decision was made when he felt a deep and lasting sense of peace about it, and a deep and lasting sense of excitement and invitation from God that this is what's next. Now, was the decision fully made just because he had made up his mind in his heart? Yes, but also no. And that's when we move to the third way of discerning, which is reason and imagination. Sometimes you are tracking your temperature over time, but you also need to know the facts. And in this case, we needed to know that we would have a place to live, that we would have jobs, that we could move our family out there and it would be fine. And so we had to use other tools at our disposal besides our effective feelings, besides tracking our temperature and conversations with God. We also had to say, is this practically possible for us? We had to look logically and reasonably at the situation. And so as we looked at that situation, what happened is that the apartment that we used to live in 5 years ago in New York City opened up. We were going to be able to move in with the same family that we had left at the same price that we had left that month. And because New York City has very good social services, we knew that when we came, we would not be uninsured for our health, right? We knew that we had to provide for our children. And so we knew that we would come to New York City, even though we didn't have jobs, we would have time to find jobs and we would still have a social safety net to rely on. So that third way of discerning that sometimes confirms your second way is to look at the facts, to look at your reason. And it may also involve imagination. It may involve imagining, okay, if I choose this alternative, say I do take this job, let me imagine what it's like to live in that job for a day or a month or a year. What is that like? How does that make me feel? How can I see God potentially acting in me in that situation? Another way to use your imagination would be to say, I'm going to imagine that I'm talking to this situation with a person that I don't know at all. Say a person I don't know at all is having the same discernment that I am. What advice would I give them, not knowing them and only knowing what they told me of their situation? Is there a particular way that I would feel led to counsel them? You can also imagine yourself either at the point of your death or from the vantage of eternity. If I look back at my life from the point of my death or from the vantage of eternal time, what would I tell myself? What advice would I give myself? What would I want myself to know? So those are 3 ways that we can make decisions or enter into discernment. I'm going to share now to come up and talk about implications for soul care providers as they help us walk through our decisions.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what it feels like to hold space for someone that's making a decision. And I just wrote down, seek inner freedom for yourself as a soul care provider, as a spiritual director. And especially if you are a pastor and a spiritual director, we may see things for the person sitting in front of us that we want them to choose. And the trick there is just to hold back your opinion and to give them the space to truly discern, knowing that they are 2 viable choices, right? And no one's going to die here. But we really hold back, even though we think one is slightly ahead of the other. So we seek our own inner freedom to let the person that we're holding space for truly be free to discern. So that's the first thing. So we bracket what we hope for that person, even though we hold hope that good things are in store for them. And then the other thing I do is what Carrie did with us at the beginning is sometimes I just ask, how have you discerned in the past? And so you get a sense of what is sort of the default or what's their most natural way of making a decision. You know, that they tend to look for scriptural directives. They have been accustomed to looking to the authority in their life. I mean, whatever it is, I make the pros and cons list. So you just reflect back to them. That's been part of their discernment in the past. It's a familiar way of connecting with God in decision making. And then you can offer, would you like to try some other ways? And so if they already do the pros and cons list, that's more along the reasoning and imagination. So hold the space for, okay, go ahead, give me what have you listed as pros and cons for each option. And then one at a time. and then invite them into imagination, and then ask the question, how does that make you feel? Right? So they've given you pros and cons for option A. How does that make you feel? Then move to pros and cons for option B, and then ask what emotions come up. So you're kind of toggling back and forth between paying attention to the affective and engaging the reason and imagination. And I'll give you an example for my husband and I. We were trying to discern what kind of car to buy during the pandemic when supplies were really low. And John is great at doing the pros and cons and getting all the specs. And he narrowed it down to something that felt super practical, but a little pricey. And so I just checked in, well, how does that make you feel? Does that give you joy? And it did not. And we'd have to drive miles away to go get it. So we just waited, right? That was just a sign to us, well, maybe we're not quite ready to pull the trigger. So that's kind of a way of toggling back and forth between the two. I will also add, sometimes folks have a default theology that says the choice is the one that's most sacrificial, the one that I will be most unhappy with, because that is sacrificing for God. Now, I know that's kind of a funky theology, but people kind of feel that way. And so to check in and to open up the space of, well, let's explore what your desires actually are. And to reassure them that God also speaks through that as well. Though he sees your willingness to sacrifice, he also speaks through your deeper desires. And so just to invite that into part of the conversation. So these are some ways to hold the space for someone that's making a discernment and to open up the different avenues by which God can speak.
All right, I'm just going to close by talking about confirming a decision. And we've talked about this a little bit as we've gone along, but we'll just make some things explicit. So these are 3 things to look for when you're confirming a decision. And one thing is this interior confirmation we've been talking about. That you've checked internally, you've checked with God, you feel that you arrived at something that is going to lead you in the direction of peace and joy and faith and a greater intimacy with God. Something that is more in line with the purpose for which God has created you and God's dreams for you and for the world. The second is community affirmation. And I want to say this may be especially valid within our Asian American context, where we do value these sort of communal ways of knowing. But you've taken your discernment to a spiritual director or a mentor or a circle of friends or your family. They've been able to ask you questions. You don't feel defensive about your decision, but you feel peace about it. And you've received affirmation from key people that are important in your life and that you consider to be offerings of wisdom for you. And the last is that you feel able to move forward with hope and faith. And I want to say that you may not be fully 100% convinced in the marrow of your bones that your decision is absolutely finally correct and that everything will go right for you from now on. You may not have that confirmation. And in fact, you may make a good decision and things may still go wrong. So I want to say that just because things don't work out as you expect does not mean that you have not listened to God and entered into a good discernment process. But you do have a sense that I started with 2 things. Either of them would be right. I've chosen this way because it feels like God is leading me this way. God is inviting me into this way. And I'm going to go this way, choosing, believing that God will be with me. God will go ahead of me. God will be for me. I can say that with confidence. And if it doesn't work out, I know that God will still be with me. I also want to say that sometimes confirming a decision or disconfirming a decision is as easy as God closing a door. You may think you have all the information, all the instinct, all the interior movements that say, go in this direction, and that door may close, right? You may have discerned that this is the house that I want to buy, in the neighborhood that I want to live in the district that my kids will thrive in. This is the place and the person may sell it to someone else. And that no you hear from God is also a way of confirming a decision or disconfirming a decision. And so just be open to that as well, that God may say no. The last slide, I want to give you some resources, the things that I've mentioned at different times. So for soul care providers, these are actually paired books. 2 books by Timothy Gallagher, who's an expert in Ignatian discernment. A handbook for spiritual directors is for soul care providers. And the book Discerning the Will of God, an Ignatian Guide for Decision Making, is if you were going through the discernment process yourself. And then for both soul care providers and discerners, these 2 books, The Way of Discernment by Elizabeth Liebert. She's also one of the authors of the book that I mentioned, The Spiritual Exercises Reclaimed for Women, when we talked about the locus of God's action. And then Discernment, Reading the Signs of Daily Life by Henry Nouwen. And that is the book that I mentioned right at the beginning of this talk. Thanks, everyone.